SM, the Media Project. Driven by data. Driven by technology. Driven by community development. Driven by the need to get results for your project. SM Graves Associates, delivering real estate development to you, including project management and pre-development services with a keen focus on delivering community-oriented projects. We build profitable projects that respond to the needs of your neighborhood. Join the SMG family. Find us at smgravesassociates.com.
I got so many things that I want to ask. First of all, let me ask this question. Is change, this transformative change, is change the exclusive priority, or is the more important priority the seeking of balance in everything that we're doing?
I would say so is change the priority or seeking balance? So what matters most is the direction, like, is the argument I would make. So I would say, like, when you say seeking balance, it kind of gives me hints of like the idea of like neutrality. I'd make the argument there's no such thing as neutrality. Like, there cannot be a neutral. Any direction of our focused energy, it transforms the world in a very specific way, but at the same time, right, it leaves many things behind. It's kind of the nature of life, right? Like, any decision we're leaving. So I don't seek. It's hard to like seek balance in today's world because it's so out of balance. Like, it's not balance to me seems to, and I may be interpreting the intent wrong, but it seems to be like, oh, we need to kind of reorient these, kind of get them back. The system's collapsing.
I think I need to find better words that I lack at the current time. What I mean is to say, we live in a time of a lot of overuse of the idea of transformative change. Right now, what we're going through in the last 100 days here in the United States of America is in fact transformative change.
Well said. Yep.
There's two issues I have with it. One, besides it just mostly isn't the kind of change I was looking for. Okay. But that's a personal opinion thing. Okay. That's just my personal perspective. But there's another problem with it is it's becoming clear to most of us that aren't perfect. Most of us that seek answers and know that I'm just going to find more questions as I seek those answers. There's an unintentionality. There's a lack of purpose in the kind of transformative change. And so I guess it's maybe it's not about balance, right? But it's more about is transformative change for the sake of it without any sort of thought about what comes next, because that can be quite detrimental, can't it? As opposed to what everything you've said in the last 5 or 10 minutes speaks to what I taught my daughters as we became less institutionally religious as a family, but coming from my days as a performing artist, this idea of soulfulness, right? You don't have to be religious to be soulful. We all have an innate personal need to create, to be that, what you just said, right? Just atoms of light, because I need to, I'm energetic and I need to hit the universe, we all have that. That's part of just being alive. And so, and it sounds like you're the type of person who wants to get as many people feeling as alive in that way as possible and help people to stay in that place, right? And not just either be complacent or feel restricted in any sort of way from being their true selves. I mean, the Jungian kind of, what you're talking about, the self-actualization, right? The pursuit of finding oneself and really understanding but also then serving others as a function of because you also spoke to that of, once I get a better understanding through the I, but I have to turn that into a we, right? Otherwise, I understand I less.
Yeah. Well said, Scott. And I think I appreciate your analysis of kind of where I'm coming from. I think that's accurate. It's like ultimately, I think one of the problems with doing this work, right, is you kind of only meet two critiques. The first critique is that what you're suggesting is not enough. It's too small. It's not going to change anything. Don't do it. You're wasting your time. The second critique is it's too utopian. It can never happen, right? We cannot possibly have it that good. In my humble opinion, the 8 dignities are neither too small nor too utopian. In fact, in the book, and it gets a little technical, right? But it's like I invent an idea called like corporate modules. Like there's plenty of ways we could fundamentally alter the institutions that were surrounding us towards a different direction. Because ultimately it comes down to your point, Scott, about like transformation for transformation's sake. I agree. That's not the ideal. What is most important is a shared direction. Okay, so like the 8 dignities, like with Spirit DAO as a church, the vision is like the members don't have to believe anything I say personally. They don't have to believe my they have to believe in temporal naturalism to be candid. Like, so long as they, feel at their deepest root that like we need to unbind rights from the state, we need to like transform like what it means to be human in this era of immense abundance and intelligence. That's the most important thing, because that will guide the how, and the how will be emergent, right? There's many emergent ways it's going to take shape. And very similar, full circle, right, to our conversation about philanthropy or venture capital, many of them will fail, right? I've had conversations with some members of the community, and it's like, guys, we may do this work our entire life. We may fail. And then failing to change the world, we'll transform ourselves, so it'll be good, right? But we have to be okay with that. Like, we have to be okay. This is like kind of the same, and it all ties, Ryan, you had mentioned in the very beginning, like, I try to live my life where it all ties together. So like the idea of like this AI project, the AI project is under a for-profit company, but the idea is to spin it off into a municipal, like public good, because there's so many people who are taking this moment, in my humble opinion, to spend a lot of time talking about what we should do or the ethics that we should have, or et cetera, but they're not building the thing. My opinion is, let's build the thing. Let's build a public good for a city. Let's give it to the city after it works and say, look what we just did. Now let's multiply it, right?
Has our academic life affected us? It done a disservice to the idea of taking action. In other words, more and more of us, and I love that part of my life, the academic life, the learning, lifelong learning, let's call it, right? But I feel like for all the formal education that exists, right, within every household in America that's had an access to that, right? Somehow we're less action oriented, just what you just said, like there's less, not to be melodramatic, but like in the times that we're in, there's far less of our leadership in particular bleeding in the streets with us, and far more people talking about things as if, well, we'll get a second chance in a little while. And I keep going like, wow, like how much worse can things get, right? We have like, we have people, we'll put a timestamp on this podcast. We have people disappearing in the street, and we're not entirely sure where they went, and they weren't taken with any due process. So like, how much worse does that get before we go, oh, well, isn't there something we should be doing about it? I'll leave it there.
It's a tough conversation to talk about for a number of reasons. And to be candid, right, I think in this climate, we all need to be very clear about what we say and publish, because this is how they are finding, let's be clear. Like many of the people who were arrested and deported were activists, right? Yeah. They're going after immigrants, illegal gang members, but this is the problem is like they grab them, they ship them out, and then there's no due process. So to your point, like it took 100 days for the American experiment to like actually collapse upon itself. Like the things that we held dearest, due process, right? A right to a trial, has collapsed already. And the problem, to your point, Scott, is I don't know if it's educational rather than it is economic and legal, because we have been conditioned, like the price for experimentation, which I would argue is like when we think about self-actualization in individual and systemic actualization, it's about like digging into that experimentalist impulse that we all have, right? It's like we want to try the thing and create the thing, but the price of failure is extreme in the United States. There's no social safety nets and they keep getting diminished, right? So it's like, and the problem is like on a flip side, right? You could have like Europe, which has high social safety nets, but there's huge barriers to like, experimentation. China being like a combination of the two. There's high social nets and there's experimental impulse, but it's like kind of constrained in direction. So you can't go a certain way. So like, how do we do that? So I would say it's more about the economic incentives of like, there's a lot to lose, and it's hard for me because I used to be much more of like an in the streets organizer. But now I have a 4.5-year-old and like, I cannot personally be kidnapped and shipped away. Like the family, I have responsibility.
Well, there's a reason why our young fight wars. There's a reason why the young or the college kids are, typically, at the barricades, right? And the sit-ins. I mean, and there's a practicality to that too, which is, we shouldn't judge each other. I mean, it's just, that's been the reality of hundreds or thousands of years, right?
Yeah. But going back to your point, I'll cap it with this. It's like, I always give the example. So when I had the home brewing business, right? Like we were there for 8 years before we got acquired, and it was a Web 2 business. So it was like physical, like products. It was warehouses. It took me 5 years. I was 24 when I started, 25. It took me to like my early 30, 31 before I was like making enough to like pay my rent. Like it was like really scrappy. So the point is like, I was quote unquote doing the American dream, right? I had this idea. I was meeting this need. We served thousands of people, right? We were teaching them practical skills, how to make beer and wine, etc. But if I had failed, I would have been 30 with nothing, no capital, no retirement. The price of failure is so extreme. And it's because we have this like dogmatic, and this is like a big, when we think about like politics, it's like we have such a dogmatic approach to, I call it single market maximals, like capitalism, right? And the problem is that even like on the left, you would argue that the greatest mistake, like it's often compared to like Karl Marx, and I don't know if this is appropriate for the podcast, right? But the biggest like critique of Karl Marx from the right, let's say, is that he frames everything in like the oppressor-oppressee relationship, which I actually think is more accurate than they give it credit for. That is a lot of part of that history, right? But what he got wrong, which I think what most of the leftists also get wrong, is that these institutional arrangements come in like prepackaged forms. So there's slavery, there's monarchy, there's capitalism. It's a box that has these rules. And then capitalism, we put that away and we open the socialism box. And all of a sudden, everything is socialist. In the argument in self-actualization, I argue for multiple market orders operating in tandem. There's nothing about the history of the United States, legal history specifically, that says that we cannot have socialist markets next to capitalist markets. And the idea is that we would introduce a hyper-competitive, like we would have greater competition if the price for experimentation was much lower and the risks were much like not as devastating. It doesn't guarantee success. It just guarantees the opportunity to try.
Right, because most of us have to fail 2, 3, 4 times before you finally hit upon the right combination of experience, team, right place, right time for your concept.
Yeah.
And it's like, I just personally had to say it, right? I had to fail 2 or 3 times in business. I didn't come from a business owning family. I didn't come from money, right? And as much as that was a struggle over time, it was either, listen, if I'm going to choose to be self-employed, that's the shit. Like that, there is no other way. I don't have a sugar daddy. I don't have, I'm not starting on third base. So either start and take that risk that you're talking about, or live a less satisfying but perhaps more stable life for a while, right? So I want to ask. I'm gonna hand it over to Ryan right now because I'm forgetting the question I was going to ask, and I have to get it back in my mind here because it was.
Well, yeah. So I want to dig in a little bit to Spirit DAO as a Web3 organization. And what you're doing, describe that a little bit in structure and what the intentional change is that organization is building toward.
Sure. And if it would be helpful, I can share visuals. I don't know if it's just pure audio or if it's recorded, but if you'd like me to share visuals, I can. But basically,
yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I'll look the slide. Just give, it'll help give you like an organizational map.
And if we can share these on our episode page later for our listeners, we will do.
Yeah, that's cool. I'll share. Give me 1 second. Let me just load it up.
So Spirit DAO, though, it's so decentralized autonomous organization. How many members do you have?
We have right now. We have like 5 or 6 members. It's small. We're relatively new. We had a very active to 2024, but in the meantime, like now, as I mentioned in the beginning, like our tech stack just wasn't enough, so now we're kind of redesigning it from scratch. But I'll show you very briefly. So a DAO, as you mentioned, Ryan, a decentralized autonomous organization. What it allows, the kind of core components of a DAO, like why would you build a DAO, is it's an on-chain organization. And for us as a 501c3 church, there's 2 very core principles where we said a DAO is the right way to do it. And really 2 core, but many on the periphery. The first is having assets on chain, right? How many stories have we heard about the preacher who has like a Rolls Royce and he's serving a community of 20,000, average income? So we want to ensure that if we're going to build a non-religion religion, we're going to build a church that's collectively owned and governed, we need to ensure that like there's pure accountability at the foundational level. So if people watching are not already aware, if you have an on-chain organization, and this is how Spirit DAO is being built, how we're building the app, is nothing moves without it going on a record for the community. So we're kind of keeping our on-chain record within our community, but members can access it. So that radical transparency, that root transparency is paramount, especially when it comes to the finances of the organization. The second is on-chain voting, right? So allowing voting in various voting schemes. So if you're not if the audience is not aware, so smart contracts allow us to create programmable rules. So you can imagine a rule to a game. But the beauty of a DAO, and the beauty of Spirit DAO specifically, and like kind of our ethos, is that like all of the rules can change. So we may choose to have a specific rule set for a specific direction for a certain period of time. But if we don't like it, we can edit it. It also allows for various governance structures. So what I mean by that, and I'm going to share my screen right now to kind of give you an idea of, let me just click the slide. Spirit DAO is organized in what we call pods. It's also known as, it's often referred to as sociocracy or not the other one, holons, basically circles within circles. So the idea is that there's Spirit DAO proper. It's the church, the 501c3. You have an executive pod. I'm one of the members of the executive pod. Mariah McKay is another member. These are, we control. We're making sure that we're staying under compliance, and we also the finances. But the idea is that different working groups can spin up. So, for example, there might be perennial working groups like the developer pod. Myself and other members are part of that. We're writing the software that we're building for our community, and but then there might be like temporary pods, like we're going to host a retreat. So we need to spin up a pod for that retreat. And the way it works is members go through a process which we've outlined. It's in this slide right here. Is our proposal process. So like they make it a little bigger for you guys. It's doing the opposite. Okay. Basically they put a forum post, they get like people aligned. If they have like three or more people who are interested, then they can then put it to a formal process. And what happens is the DAO votes. So as a nonprofit, we have 2 intercommunity currencies. We have what we call system and self. System is a fiat bound currency. It's bound to the dollars in the nonprofit's bank account. So there can never be any, we issue them and burn them as we spend money. But so hypothetically, an events pod might spin up a pod and say, hey, we need $5,000 to do this retreat. It's going to cover these expenses. The DAO would vote on it. And then those individuals are responsible for managing it. And typically there's milestones. And for large capital amounts, you can hard code staggered release. So you show us milestones 1, 2, and 3. There's independent approvers or reviewers who are not part of the initiative will review it. And if they say, oh, it looks good, then the smart contract automatically releases those dollars, which then can be burned. And then the bank account money goes in. And another beautiful part about the DAO, which really excites me because I'm kind of a governance nerd, is every pod can have their own governance structure. So what I mean by that is we might have Spirit DAO proper as a direct democracy. So truly DAO, core vision things might be one person, one vote. But the dev pod might have a republic kind of thing where we elect, experienced developers who are guiding the development. We might have a physical, part of the DAO's objective is to acquire physical property, retreat spaces that we would host events at, etc. So that might be organized as a hierarchy. There might be one person in charge because, they got to maintain the property. They got to do all the stuff that comes with running a business that's, physical. So we might want to program in monarchical rules for that case. So it allows for multiple governance structures to arise and then transform as the needs of the community transforms. It also really encourages agency. Like my vision with Spirit DAO is we want to empower people to do the work without confining them to a specific way of doing the work. Right. So get it done however lights you on fire, but just get it done and get it done in a way that's transparent, etc. So that's kind of how we've organized the DAO. The second currency, and then I'll pause after this for we can pull in threads, is our self tokens, which are time bound tokens. So it's purely we're saying an hour is an hour, right? We all have different skills, we all have different values, but at the end of the day, if we're directing an hour of focus towards Spirit DAO, we're going to catalog that, and that will be, we may leverage the time-bound tokens for governance because we're not allowing you can donate, and that might unlock certain privileges. Like we're a church, we won't be able to tithe, obviously, but governance is not tied to capital. That's a key failure of many DAOs past, and Ryan, I'm sure you're aware, but that's when whales come in, it's just capitalism reinvented, right? So we didn't want that for our church, obviously. So there's time-bound tokens, and then they could also be exchanged for unique items. So we own a bunch of artistic IP. So we can make, for example, 50 unique posters that we'll never print again. And you could only buy them with 5, time-bound tokens, 5 self tokens. So that's just kind of a high-level overview of how we're thinking about the DAO and how we're experimenting. But if you guys have any specific threads or questions, I'm happy to dive deeper into anything we talked about.
Yeah, well, I want to turn this to Scott because I'm sure he's got some questions popping up. And there's really a couple things here, though. One is, given that this tech is so nascent still, this is a church teaching people how to go out and build real world businesses and organizations, right? One of your members could learn from this process and go, oh, this is how I want to run my nonprofit. Maybe we start a little cohort to help that get started here. And then we spin up another entity over here with this group of people that's going to go build a service organization or build a company using these models, these tools, and this concept. And I also, one of the things that I mentioned before we started recording here is the faith-sponsored housing model that I know Scott and I have talked a lot about, that derived from work that he's doing. And it's all about, how do we develop economic models, incorporate those with governance, and build real world works and services, buildings that house people, financial structures that don't kick people out as they run out of income in their last years in life, right? How do we build systems and institutions that people can really have faith in again? And while what you're building is spiritual in a sense and is a church, it's a model for any other organization, any other institution that we are trying to build in today's age.
The observation I would make about Ron's development here is that it reminds me of two things. One, starting in the 1980s, one of the last frontiers of popular music became, and this was best exemplified in what they called world music, where, we now need to take a lot of well-established traditions within Western music and Eastern music and other traditions for that matter, and we need to find creative ways to synthesize them, right? And that became the new frontier of new progressive music. And it also strikes me as one culture and one nationalism, nation, rather. China, the one nationality, China. China is this curious place when you really start to look at the way the different types of business models and also governance models within municipality, village to county to province to country. They're very pragmatic. They like to synthesize a variety, and this, you spoke somewhat to this in your own way, Ron, earlier. They're a communist nation, but they've adopted facets of capitalism over the last 40 years. They've adapted actually all kinds of models and they've synthesized them together. And often it's a question of what works best at the municipal level doesn't work best at the national level and everything in between. And it's not meant to be perfect, and it's evolving all the time, but it's meant to be able to evolve over time and to be at the least, the most resilient and the least, informative. When it needs to change, it possibly can change. And what you're talking about is synthesizing facets of our existing society over the last hundreds of years with, and also, I'm not going to call it religion. It's not so institutional, right? You're deinstitutionalizing it and taking, my words, not yours, this idea of soulfulness, the idea of belonging, right?
Yeah.
And the best parts of that with the best parts of really a lifelong search for who you are as an individual, right? So that you can bring the best facets of yourself to the party, right? When the party's together. There's all of this kind of going on, it seems to me, in what you're doing.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, I would say, Scott, to your point, I think you're spot on. Like with the kind of analysis of the synthesis. Like I make the comment in my talks and lectures sometimes that's like the greatest challenge is like not that we're here, right, with all these challenges, but it's like we've actually lacked viable alternatives. So like, what does it look like when we create an alternative and kind of actually give people like a pathway to enact that alternative? You mentioned belonging, which I think is a slam dunk. I think it's at the heart of like the meaning in value crisis is like, how do we figure out belonging? Because ultimately, like the challenge with many of the inherited spiritual institutions is, there's like a selective hypocrisy that's associated with them. And that in itself is not that bad. The problem is that there's no consensus, right? So some groups are like oppressive towards disenfranchised people. Some groups are willing to elevate them, right? So it's kind of like they have the same label. And then there's obviously like, there's the metaphysical supernatural aspect, which I think is a product of like, I make the argument, and I do in the book, that all religions attempt to serve are the human struggle with groundlessness, which is like doubt, it's never enough, insatiability, which is desire, right? It's groundlessness is what's the point, excuse me. Insatiability, desire is like it's never enough, and then not to death, right? All metaphysic is a response to death. It's like a root kind of philosophy of like, designed in a time vastly different than anything else we're used to, where like life was much more brutal in its dishing of expiration. So
death was up until 150, 160 years ago. Death was a lot more with us every day, and in certain respects, we had a healthier relationship with death.
Yeah.
But also, what came out of it is what you're describing, right? Is the religious, the metaphysical, one issue I take with any singular institution of religion is that, and that with the hypocrisy that you describe, is that, it's simply because we can't accurately answer the question, who's right, who's wrong. The answer, of course, is we're all right.
With fast-moving and sweeping changes to our economy in the works, we all need to reconsider how our investments are best placed. At Partners in Housing, we believe your money is best placed locally. Utilized to increase value and provide stable and desirable housing to your neighbors. Contact Partners in Housing to find out how you can participate in local housing opportunities by joining the Partners in Housing Fund. Look us up at partnersinhousingvt.com or email us at partnersinhousingvt@gmail.com.
And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying that all religion is right. I'm saying we all deserve to exist. And there's no better reason for that than we're here, right? So we're here. And as soon as we start to say, no, but the way my group of people has it up here, we've really got it right. You see, everybody else has it wrong, but we got it right. It can't be true. And the way we know that is because of this tension that's created between the religions, right? Because at some point in time you have to say, but we're right and they're wrong, because it becomes comparative. It just happens, right? Because well, how do you explain the fact that we think a certain set of ways and they think a different set of ways? How did that happen? Well, it's very simple. We're right. They're wrong. That you could just imagine this 0 point where that's how it started, and then,
I love this thread, and if I could pull on it a little bit more. So I think one of the most common misconceptions about religion when people talk about it is they purely think it's a spiritual orientation, but religion is equally a political technology, right? The Bible, the Quran, the Torah, these are all political technologies. They talk about organizing society. They talk about which groups of people you can exclude, which groups of people you can include, right? These are deeply political structures, and they were designed in a tribal era of human prosperity. So of course they contain within them, each of them, the mandate for war, if you will. And this is one of my core arguments is, like, so long as these texts are sacred, so long as we say this book is sacred, 90% of the people are going to be good people. They're just going to want to, they're going to embody that, whether it be the infinite love, the non-attachment, whatever. But you'll always have a group of fanatics who take the worst aspects of those texts and then put them into practice and then use them to justify wars, to kill children, et cetera, et cetera. And this is history. So this is the problem, is you cannot escape it when you kind of embody this. And when you talk about metaphysics, the problem with metaphysics at its root is that metaphysics tells us the way the world must be. But nature rejects that. Nature says, no, there is no model. It's all novel. Novelty is the root. Change is the root. Time governs the relationships of the universe. So when we think about a nature-oriented spirituality, to your point, Scott, of the soulfulness, we are both, if the material nature of reality is in fact infinite, which I argue it is, then we are both within it, right? As individuals, we each occupy a conscious coordinates, a space that no one else can occupy. But of it, we possess an aspect of that infinity. That is that divinity that we need to respect and recognize in the other to kind of bring us that level. But the challenge is, of course, is that religion is more of an identity than it is a belief for most people. It's like parents were this, I'm this. I haven't read the book, but
it's that short list of, I drive a Lexus, I have a 4-bedroom house, I garden, and I'm a Catholic. It's the, and I, having been a deeply religious Roman Catholic growing up, and I have to say, having gotten so much positive aspects of it for so long that have lasted with me to this day. But ultimately the thing that made me reject the church, not the soulfulness of it, not Catholic or Christian philosophy, and Jesuit teaching and Augustinian teaching, but it's the institution. It's the institution that tells you, now that you're an adult, I know when you were a child, we told you, love everybody, right? But there's some other things we want you to know. And that is, see this group over here, we feel bad for them. Now, we're good Christians, so we're not going to hurt them. We're not saying, kill them like we used to, but you need to reject those people. And if you have any friends, we don't want them to come to the church, and we don't want to, and all this kind of stuff, and you go, wait a minute, this feels very, you hit it earlier, it's very hypocritical. Like, can't we have all the best aspects of this without all of the inhumanity? Because to me, it's all just inhumanity, right? Mm-hmm. So now bring this back to what you're doing and what you're developing and what you're doing in essence to me, okay? I'm not telling you what you're doing. I'm just saying, as an observer, I feel like you're on this great last frontier of how do we synthesize those things which we know are deeply soulfully beneficial to us as individuals and as groups. How do we take the best of everything we've learned? And it's not about avoiding the worst. It's about not using them, if that makes sense, Like, how do we intentionally not build into all of these things infallibility? One of our greatest gifts and yet our greatest perversions as human beings is agriculture. Because agriculture allowed us to build community, build cities. It also allowed one man to say to another, oh, you're coveting what I have. Well, oh, you say you're starving? That's nice. You didn't grow your crops the same way I did. These are my crops. I determine what happens with these crops. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So the last frontier is, how do we take the best of what we've learned over 10,000 years? And how do we intentionally not fall into these traps?
Yeah, I think that is a good way to summarize it. It's basically, from my perspective, it's just like, how do we align ourselves around a vision of the alternative that is actionable, that is real? It's not just purely a fantasy, but is still big enough that would fundamentally reshape what it means to be human, right? It's like, how do we tie ourselves into that greater vision where we become, and ultimately we're doing this work because we understand that should we be successful on the off chance, that there is success on the horizon, that it could fundamentally redefine our relationships with the world, right? And it could fundamentally redefine what it means to be human. I mean, it just, again, it makes me, it sickens me that we live in an era of relative abundance, but it's so stratified, right? It's so, and it's just becoming more and more stratified. And it's like,
it's a manufactured scarcity.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I love that language. Yeah. And, and then of course there is, it's no secret. Many of the billionaire class have their bunkers. They just hide away from the problem, as if their security guards won't turn on them in a moment.
Which is like, how do you do, it's bad enough to think, sorry, Guatemala, I'm going to pick on you for a minute. It's bad to think in a country of, say, 3 or 4 million people like Guatemala, right? But in a country of 300 million, 30 million people like Guatemala, in a country of over 300 million like ours, you can't build enough bunkers. You can't have a big enough private army. In fact, I don't believe you can build a solid enough authoritarian regime, right? Because at some tipping point in the future, you got 330, 340 million people whose lives are entirely destabilized. And you look and you go, what makes it even more ridiculous than on its face is it was completely unnecessary. I'm going to ask a question regarding this. Speaking of false scarcity, is it a coincidence that we're seeing internationally, not just the United States, it's being led by us, but this convergence of authoritarianism in a hard look at restricting rights of people, and the first generation diffusion of artificial intelligence. I am not blaming the tech. I am simply saying, for those that control the tech and stand to derive the most value from that first generation of that technology, is it a coincidence that we're seeing the convergence of artificial intelligence at the same time we're seeing a potential proliferation of authoritarianism?
It's a great question. I mean, the short answer is I don't know if it's a coincidence or not. I think what's, address the rising authoritarianism, right? What we have is progressively more globally, but the United States leading it is especially important, because what happened in the United States over the last 40 years, right, is like we've transitioned. When you think about economies, economies of functions, you went from a sustenance farming economy, right, and then you went to an industrial economy, and during that time, there was a shortcut. You could take a farmer, you could put him in a factory, you could say, hey, pull this lever. Don't do anything else, just pull the lever, right? Pull it. You're going to pull it 100 times a day for, the rest of your life. But you're going to pull that lever and you're going to work. And they could do that. Then we transitioned into this more the late 90s, 2000s up into the present, is what I call knowledge economy. You call it the marginal economy, whatever. The
rise of the creative class.
Yeah, the creative class.
Richard Florida's whole thing, yeah.
And there's no shortcut. You cannot take someone who's worked in an assembly line for 30 years, put them in front of a PC and say, write me a Python script to do this thing, right? It doesn't work like that. There's a whole amount so the challenge is there's no shortcut. So what you had was an institutional narrative stemming back say hundreds of years, where all of a sudden the white working class had this social contract be rumpled, right? They not only did they have they were the target of like the transition for cleaner energy, the transition of outsourcing manufacturing, and we moved to a financialization economy, right? So there's in the book I read, there's a chapter called Finance in the Real Economy. And the problem is that today finance serves finance. It doesn't serve the productive agenda of society.
So that's right. It doesn't, but we don't bank new business. Banks bank each other, but we sell money. We can trade money off the value of money without it ever hitting the real economy, right?
Yes.
We could basically just trade currency all day long and treasury notes and all's well with the world while the rest of Main Street isn't funded.
Yeah. I mean, in most, to your point, the trading, it's not even like, people trading, it's high frequency algorithmic trading, right? So we've written software.
It's servers that are inches from each other.
Exactly. So we have to, like, when we were, and the problem too with that is like, okay, you can imagine in one possible scenario, okay, so the white working class fail, and then over 40 years, there's nothing to like alleviate the failure. What they do, they pumped heroin into the town, opiates, right? They create a central, just destroyed livelihoods. And
they privatize prisons.
Yeah,
they gradually create the infrastructure underneath our very eyes to basically deal with the problem without actually creating any sort of solution.
Yeah, we have a for-profit weapons manufacturing industry. That is a central export, right, of ours. So we're at perpetual war because we have unlimited capital donations to our political structure, right? So you see how they're all interweaved, but basically it's finance serving itself, which is like the kind of core poison. Now, the problem with that, right, to your point, Scott, about the US dollar is we are now in our present, like today, what has happened because of the bolstering of tariffs? Now we have China, what is easily our most, I would never use the word rival because I don't view other people as rivals, but economically, that's the narrative we're fed. They're our rival. And what did they do? They said, no, we're not backing down. We're not going to give you a phone call. And now what has that done? Emboldened the rest of the world for an alternative order. So the rise of authoritarianism is, I mean, Putin on one end, was able to, through what is likely I think if there's a retrospect to 100 years, we'll realize that most of the algorithmic feeds that we're all exposed to are pre-programmed and, it's all fake. And I'm not even on like social media anymore. I can't digest. Twitter is just such a cesspool. Even Reddit, I can't trust anything you read. It's like so many bots have been, it's like there's a name for it. I forget what it's called, but someone's written about it. It's like the death of the internet. It's just like all fake now, like everything you read, you have to say it's actually a person. Like, so the authoritarian regime will fail. Like Trump et al. This is just the dying throes of like a high finance, like a financial economy, a financial government on its last legs.
It is a great point. None of these things last very long, right? There is no fascist or other type of authoritarian regime ever that's lasted for a long period of time. Of course, the question is, does it last my lifetime, your lifetime? How long does violence occur? This is all the negative effects, of course, to say the least. That's an understatement of living through a time period with that kind of thing happening, right?
Yeah. I think violence is inevitable given the present trajectories. You can't have brown shirts busting people's doors with no warrants and not saying anything. And if someone's gonna get shot, I'm not saying that as positive, but
well, and speaking directly to the economic part of this that you just mentioned, it seems to me that what's held up the financialization of things for as long as it has is probably more input than any other has been, as long as the United States has been stable relative, no matter how much the shit show is happening here, as long as we're stable compared to all other nations, and our 10-year treasury notes therefore are valuable to people because we are the most stable shit show, that kept things going. Now we see within the last 90 days of the Trump administration, that's not the case anymore. And there's been a relatively, it could be a faster run, but there's been a run on 10-year treasury notes. Now, that has a floor. That it's not like we can get to a 0 point with that and maybe it'll come back up. Well before zero, there's a point at which we're through. There's a point at which, with all other foreign nations doing that, and other nations like Canada and the EU gradually buying them back at fire sale prices to accelerate the process on purpose, there's a point at which the Chinese say, I know we haven't sold them yet, but we have no other choice but to sell off our 10-year treasury bonds and maybe even our 20 and 30 and 40-year treasury bonds. Once that happens, the world is, we assume, thrust into a global depression that's at least as bad and as long as the last global depression, which nobody wants to go through. And so, but then, yeah, I mean, I won't say that would be a good thing because it'll start to change things, because I don't want to have to go through what my grandparents did. But I'm just saying,
But
it's not good.
It goes to your point, and I'll wrap up here. And I apologize for knocking my daughter at home. But your point about like the authoritarianism and like the collapse, right? So like if we assume, whether or not we assume that people of our government are compromised perhaps by a foreign government, and there's ill intentions of like the U.S. like petro dominance that's taking place over the last 60, 70 years. The idea being that like in the fall, let's say, as we're describing, in the collapse, that gives the authoritarian, let's say the established authoritarian, even greater foothold, right? Because there is no one to kind of back away from them. So it's like we would see that, like, it's unsurprising to me, given my understanding of history and just like the economic circumstances that we are in, the circumstance we're in. I shouldn't say that. Like, it's also like it's difficult to say you could blame voter apathy, but like there's rumors that the voting was compromised, right? So like who knows? Again, it's so difficult to like have a sense, and that like compounds our problem. Is like we don't have a clear thing. So ultimately, with Spirit DAO, with Temporal Naturalism, my focus is the alternative. What's next? Like, so how do we get the momentum moving now? So when it truly hits the fan, so to speak, and there's real, genuine, not the threshold of people who can just say, well, it's not me, etc. It gets to an untenable point. Like, what is next? Well, we want to have an alternative ready to go that's in motion already towards a different vision of the good. That's not just some other authoritarian startup, crew that just has like a regional dominance. And so I digress. This is fascinating. It's so off track, but I love it.
Yeah, well, this is great. And, we might have to cut it into two parts or something, but, so I want to sort of pick up on Spirit DAO, where we were at really, and we'll kind of wrap it up here with what is the vision for Spirit DAO in terms of going forward, and what's the call to action? What can individuals do? How can they participate? How can they pick up these tools and be part of this positive change?
I really appreciate that opportunity, Ryan. So Spirit DAO right now is in this, as I mentioned, we're kind of in this transitory phase. We had our proof of concept. It was really successful. And we're now building like our infrastructure for the alternative. So presently it's invite only. You should know a member and you share interest. And like what I would say is like get on our newsletter. You can go to Spirit DAO. That's DAO.org. And just get our newsletter because like we keep everyone pretty up to date, but we're kind of just in a grind phase of just writing code every night until this app is launched. My hope is that it's ready next month and we onboard. And then we're thinking it'll be much more of like a kind of viral one-to-one invite. Like we'll generate user invite codes. You can kind of invite people in, because one thing we're concerned about is like agential AI, like fake people. So like we're very big on proof of humanity and like making sure that like that's part of our process. But our vision behind this is like ultimately Spirit DAO represents an opportunity under what I would say is arguably the ideal financial structure to do it, to fundamentally work towards a larger vision of humanity and align us, despite our differences, right? Align us around a vision of the good that allows us to celebrate our differences, but also kind of collaborate around narrowing that gap of like opportunity and who can participate in the creative, imaginal agenda of society. And I think that's a vision, that's very compelling. It's very compelling to me. It's very compelling to others. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is just kind of share that, hey, there is another way. And like, there are people, although it's in its infancy, there are people working on it right now and who have been working on it for some years. And if this is of interest, you should come be a part of it, whether that's, directly getting involved, whether that's donating, right? We're a 501c3, you can make a tax write-off donation, right? So there's plenty of ways to kind of contribute. But we are in this kind of transitory phase. So we're hoping within the next month or two that the prototype MVP app for like just basic community voting and finance is ready to go. And I believe we're going to be on target. And then from there, we're going to kind of open up membership and kind of do it in a straightforward way. But what I would say is spiritDAO.org. You can read Self-Actualization in the Age of Crisis or download it for free at singletruths.org. So you can just download the book for free. We also have a YouTube channel with like a ton of like the lectures we've given and some community events. So that's a great place if that's more of your style. Which is at spiritDAO. But yeah, basically, if what I've said is resonant, please check us out. Sign up for the newsletter. We're getting ready to do like a large launch once we kind of have like our infrastructure ready. And so we'd be excited to have as many new faces as possible on this. And I believe that, again, compared to many of the other meta-modern spiritual movements or maybe like activism things, that we're kind of synthesizing a lot of different points to kind of give us a direction, but also give us the tools to like actionize it. I think that's like what's missing a lot in like movement work is like genuine tools to kind of build outside the system as opposed to just trying to change it from within. And that's what we're trying to do. And this is a long-term play, like a long-term plan for us. So many of us have been doing this work, and just deeply appreciate Brian, you and Scott as well for not only the conversation, but the opportunity just to share a bit about it with you and your audience.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Great. Yeah.
Can't go wrong with human fundamentals.
That's right. That's right. So folks can plug in now, stay tuned to what you're doing, catch on the launch, and look forward to people finding these tools and building on them. I mean, that's the great thing, is that this is not a static thing like so many others. This is a very dynamic tool set and solution. And it's really what I think in many ways, it's what we need to be building on. So thank you so much, Ron. Really appreciate you sharing everything you have with us. Really appreciate the work that you're doing, the perspectives that you've got. And thank you, Scott, for all this great background and insight that you bring to it. It's so great to co-host these conversations with you. And thank you all for listening. Really appreciate anyone tuning in here and pursuing more knowledge.
Find Innovato 2 on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and subscribe to Interchain Live on YouTube for video podcasts. Innovato 2 is a collaboration of Interchain Live and M the Media Project.